Just let it in.
And welcome to it, a Star Wars show, and I'm your host, John Justice. I'm glad you've joined me once again in a galaxy far, far away. As always, if you want to email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or if you happen to be enjoying the show up on YouTube, you can go and leave a comment there, and I'm happy to go and share those with the audience and you coming up next week on the show. Looking at a bit of breaking news before we dive into what I had officially planned on talking about this week. Lucasfilm seems likely to follow the path in replacing Kathleen Kennedy. This is The Hollywood Reporter in a brand new story that's just came out. Despite speculation about outside candidates, including the former 20th Century head Emma Watts, insiders say the company will most likely promote from within to replace Kathleen Kennedy. The current thinking is a scenario where Chief Executive Creative Officer Dave Filoni and production head Carrie Beck, both Lucasfilm veterans, would take co-head roles. Even as an arm of Disney, Lucasfilm remains in many ways a family business. As a George Lucas protege, Dave Filoni long has been considered a golden boy, but the knock against him is that he might be too steeped in Star Wars lore and risks steering a show into dense mythology that loses a broader audience. Oh, give me a break. That's what I like to call a story stretch. They're looking for things to talk about. Listen, Dave Filoni is talented enough to be able to know when to pull back and when to go deep. Getting back to what's being reported here, he's not the Andor guy. He's the Ahsoka guy, says one Disney insider. That's just dumb. Beck, who joined the company in 2012, knows the ins and outs, but neither she nor Filoni have much experience, which could be mitigated by Kennedy's continued presence as a producer on certain Star Wars projects, ensuring quality control in the short term. Listen, like I said, these types of takes and these individuals, they know what it is they're doing. They're not being signed off by one person. This is not a scenario where you go back and look at what George Lucas did during the prequel trilogy. And we're not looking at a scenario where George was essentially calling all the shots. And, you know, even though he had his producer there sort of helping to guide him along the way and providing some constructive feedback, I think most people know that when you go back and watch those documentaries, you know, George had his vision and he moved forward with it. It was less of a democracy, less of a committee guiding these particular stories. So when it comes to Dave Filoni needing to pull back, you know, there are groups and committees that talk about these things. Now, I will say that to the example of Andor, and I'll talk a bit about that because I think Andor is going to change the trajectory on a lot of projects moving forward, and I've mentioned this recently on shows, on recent shows. But listen, I understand the difference between what Tony Gilroy did with Andor versus what Dave Filoni did. So there certainly is that aspect of it. But I think what Tony Gilroy tapped into was something that Jon Favreau did initially with that first season of The Mandalorian. You know, the first and second seasons of The Mandalorian are sort of universally praised, wherein it's the third season where there are aspects of it that I love when things got really kind of wonky. But a lot of content around that time got wonky. A lot of injecting of different things entered into the mix. The push towards streaming in the wake of the pandemic and all of this had a huge impact on content across the board, regardless of genre, regardless of IP, regardless of studio. What Tony Gilroy was able to do, not being a Star Wars fan, was he just took proper storytelling elements, tried and true good storytelling, tried and true good writing, stories that are relatable, that we've seen before, but told in a fresh new way and in a Star Wars galaxy. That's what good Star Wars does. That's what Jon Favreau did with those first two seasons of The Mandalorian. But I also firmly believe that Dave Filoni is totally capable of doing that. And again, I'm just going to add in that there is something to be said in bringing in an outsider focused solely on storytelling that may be somewhat removed from the Star Wars universe. But it doesn't always have to be that way. If you are a good writer, if you are a good content creator, a good storyteller, and a massive Star Wars fan, you can tell a good Star Wars story. Andor was a massive success and universally praised, especially Andor Season 2. And having gone through a complete rewatch of Andor Season 1 just recently, because my wife got so into Andor, we ended up watching it again because she'd only watched the Season 1 shows one time around. Those shows were absolutely elevated from my first viewings of those episodes in Season 1 because of the events that took place in Season 2. But Season 2 is a much better season overall than Season 1 was, in my opinion. Partly because it actually leaned more into Star Wars. And the reason it did that is because I believe that Tony Gilroy became more familiar with Star Wars. And so therefore it took on more of a Star Wars feel. So I just don't buy into you need to have an outsider to create good Star Wars, which is kind of what I was pulling from this Hollywood Reporter story. So I'm fine with both of these. What I'm probably most excited about, though, is that with the success of Andor, it'll get them at least rethinking some of what they've been doing in the past, so that hopefully mistakes in my mind that I have regarding shows that have come out and have been lackluster, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Book of Boba Fett to be more specific, aspects of the Acolyte I loved while the lows were really low, which is what I want to talk about next on the show. But as always, this news just kind of dropped right before I started the podcast this week. So you kind of got my really raw, unfiltered thoughts, but I'd love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube and your thoughts of Dave Filoni and Carrie Beck essentially taking over the role of Kathleen Kennedy at Lucasfilm.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
Now, the Acolyte was back into the news this week because the creator of the Acolyte, Leslie Headland, was talking about how she was actually looking to George Lucas as inspiration, thinking what would George do when she created the Acolyte. The influx of Star Wars TV shows has allowed a generation of fans to put their personal stamp on the universe that Lucas created, according to this article that I have here in front of me. Leslie Headland thought, how would George Lucas handle this? And was this potentially part of the problem that Acolyte had? For Leslie Headland, everything started with the visual language that Lucas established back in 1977. We absolutely wanted to honor the way that he chose to shoot the original Star Wars. The stuff that really inspired him beyond his love of sci-fi was documentary filmmaking and racing documentaries. There's a lot of static camera. There isn't a lot of movement. It was pre-Steadicam. As the showrunner and director of the first two episodes, she hoped to avoid going in there and trying to make something not feel like Star Wars. She ended up enlisting a cinematographer, Chris Teague, who had worked previously on Russian Doll with Leslie Headland. They both lived in Brooklyn at the time, and they would discuss the shows quite a bit. Teague recalls how it took all of her influences from Star Wars, but also Chinese martial arts films and the way that photography impacted her as a viewer and how she wanted to bring that energy to the show. The article goes on to talk about one of the things that Headland and Teague did distinguish in The Acolyte, which takes place 100 years before the events of The Phantom Menace, was to create a vibrant color palette. Whether inspired by the Wuxia movies, I'm unfamiliar with those, or Powell and Pressburg's Black Narcissist, also not familiar with that. Headland wanted that classic high-contrast color palette that feels almost unrealistic. And this was coupled with comments that she made where she was really trying to go and channel George Lucas when she made The Acolyte. Now, of course, The Acolyte ended up becoming one of the most divisive pieces of Star Wars content in the Disney era, next to The Last Jedi. And that being said, I think what is discussed in this article in terms of the handmade aesthetic in an attempt to honor the original Star Wars, I thought that they did really well. I very much enjoyed the look in terms of the production of The Acolyte, even though the filming in and of itself came off as very cheap. And I don't know why that is. When you look at The Acolyte next to Andor, there just is no comparison. Considering the fact of the amount of money they spent on The Acolyte, now they ended up spending considerably more on Andor, and it shows, but why they couldn't make The Acolyte look like a show like Andor, and what that would have done potentially to assist in the show beyond some of the failures in terms of the story beats, I just don't know. I mean, it seems like it was probably a choice by the creators to make it look that way. It didn't work. There was a graininess to it that I feel like was meant to be artistic that just didn't end up really being all that satisfying in the end. Look, at a bare minimum, regardless of how you feel about The Acolyte, whether you're a massive fan and you think that the criticism was unwarranted or whether you think that it's some of the worst material that's ever made, I'm glad that it got made simply from the standpoint of it was so divisive. These studios, these companies, these creators, these content creators can always learn something from it. And I'm actually looking forward to going back and doing a rewatch of The Acolyte because there's enough positive things within the storytelling, and I actually did enjoy the story, apart from some of the missed beats, to where I can still absolutely go and enjoy it. Much in the same way that I do, again, I know people get annoyed with me when I say this, but Return of the Jedi being one of the weakest films of all the films, but it's still a film that I go and enjoy nonetheless. All right, let's move over into some other news this week.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
Luke Skywalker actor Mark Hamill officially rules out Star Wars Return. There's no way I'm going to appear as a naked Force ghost. 73-year-old Mark Hamill was asked about a potential return as Luke's Force ghost in the, say, upcoming Rey-led Star Wars movie, and his answer was loud and clear, no chance. Listen, Mark Hamill says that until they back up the money truck to his house. After all, Luke has left his robes behind in 2017's Last Jedi. He went on to say, I'm so grateful to what George... let's see. I'm sorry, I lost my thought here. I'm so grateful to George Lucas for letting me be a part of that back in the day. The humble days when George was called Star Wars, the most expensive, low-budget film ever made. We never expected it to become a permanent franchise or a part of pop culture. But my deal is, I had my time. I'm appreciative of that, but I don't really think they should focus on the future. I think they should focus on the future and new characters. Listen, none of this surprises me at all. Mark Hamill has become, apart from all of this, an incredibly divisive figure in terms of political commentary. He's always been critical of Star Wars in the latter years and certainly was a part of the fandom menace, in my opinion, with his views of the Last Jedi. So these comments don't surprise me at all. But at the same time, if Mark Hamill is offered enough money, I certainly do not see him staying away or turning down an opportunity to make a buck or two. One more last point on this, since we're on The Last Jedi, and it's a thought that I've had since watching Andor, and I keep forgetting to mention it, so I'll go ahead and do it now. Say what you will about The Last Jedi, and say what you will about the Canto Bight sequence in The Last Jedi. But that whole casino sequence in The Last Jedi helped the scenes on Chandrila in Andor. And also those scenes when they went to the planet in one of the latter episodes in Skeleton Crew, when they were on that posh planet in the hotel where They were going out and bathing in the mud pits and all that. Both of those sequences, the wedding sequences, the opulence that was shown in Andor, that moment on that planet at that resort in Skeleton Crew, those both benefited by the trail that was blazed in the production design work from the team and Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi. I know that was off-putting for a lot of people at the time, but that's one of the first things that I thought of watching Andor, going, we are really open to all of this being Star Wars, and it's in large part because of what we saw in The Last Jedi. So I just wanted to give some credit where credit is due. And I suppose I probably should have used this sounder relating to Mark Hamill a moment ago.
This is not going to go the way you think.
Yeah, that's actually Mark Hamill when Lucasfilm shows up and knocks on his door and asks him to be a Force ghost in Season 2 of Ahsoka. This is not going to go the way you think. All right, let's go here.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right. First off, we hear from Canadian Red 5, who writes this. James here again. I guess I should choose a catchy name if I'm going to keep emailing the show, so let's go with Canadian Red 5. Haven't gotten to your 4th book yet, but I will soon. Hey, they're not going anywhere. Canadian Red 5. Just wanted to comment on something you mentioned in the last couple of shows about the Andor crew doing a series following Rebels alongside the original trilogy. How cool would it be if it was like Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where what happened in the Marvel movies timeline actually affected the circumstances in the TV series? Multiple times in the series, they referenced the movies, and I always thought that was a kind of cool crossover. You know, Canadian Red 5, I think that's a great idea. Unfortunately, I feel like the moment that happened, that the fans would just complain like they always do. Like it was fan service or somebody's changing canon. Not that they shouldn't be ignored, but that being said, it's a great idea, but that's how the fandom would end up reacting to that. All right, let's go and hear from Blue Bobadoo 100, who writes this. Hopefully, every streaming service learns the right lessons from Andor and Severance. Quality is the most important thing. Word of mouth is better than all the advertising money can buy. If you have a genuinely great show with committed showrunners, see it through to the end. It will gain fans and subscribers. But more importantly, it will build trust that people's favorite shows won't get canceled if the first season doesn't do Stranger Things numbers. No, that's a really great point, Blue Bobadoo. I appreciate it, and thank you for writing into the show this week. Schubertuck says this. We are a few weeks from the Battle of Yavin, relating to how we could be one BBY at the start of episode 12 of Andor Season 2. So technically, it must still be BBY, but towards the very end of that year. That's how I see it. That makes sense to me, because I was looking for the time jump in those episodes, and I just could not find them. Friend of the show, Disney Desi writes this. I think the timeline, back to this issue, could be like November or December in 1 BBY. Technically 1 BBY, but that doesn't mean it's a full year before the Battle of Yavin. For example, my sons are 13 months apart, but because the older one was born in December and the younger was born 13 months later, if you just look at the years, 2020 and 2022, you might think they're 2 years apart. However, in reality, they're barely 1 year apart. Also, another really good analogy. And I appreciate you helping me with my enjoyment of watching the show, so I'm not thinking about when was the time jump during that particular episode. Lastly, Mark Jackson writes this. I really hope and feel that they could revisit these characters in a couple of years in a series that, again, follows the Rebels through the periods of the original trilogy movies. Have a season devoted to the escape from Yavin, the search for the Hoth base, then jump after The Empire Strikes Back to have them work with the Bothan spies to uncover the Death Star 2. You could incorporate the criminal underworld, bounty hunters, and Hutts. I think Tony Gilroy and his team would do a fantastic job. There are so many stories they can explore in this timeline. Clea is basically Leia's assistant, Winter, from the old EU. She even looks like her, which would be a nice tie-in to the body doubles, that Leia's mother Padme used in the prequel trilogy. Let's continue with Val and Wilmon and Mothma and see how they bring down the Empire. We need a petition to get Disney to continue the story with these characters. No petitions. I'm not a big fan of petitions. That's just not my... I'm with you. I think it's a great idea. It's the same thing that I suggested on the show, but just no petitions. That's completely unnecessary. All right, listen. Kind of a quick one this week, but that wraps up the show this week. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. And when you have a moment, support what I do here on the podcast. And if you enjoy reading science fiction, we already know you love Star Wars, I hope you'll take a moment and check out my 7-book science fiction series, Embark. A fun, fast-paced, action-packed, epic science fiction adventure without an agenda. The description for book 1 goes like this. Katha's father died 1 year ago. Yesterday, he gave her the key to saving humanity. She just doesn't know it yet. Deep inside D-Corp, the planet's largest civilian and military spacecraft factory, an industrial accident has set off a catastrophic chain of events. Unaware of the disaster, Taft Guardia eagerly agrees to help fellow pilot Katha Morrow investigate a cryptic message from her past. War erupts as D-Corp's ruthless leader attempts to exploit the chaos and seize control. Meanwhile, Taft and Katha discover what may be the only hope of saving Earth's evacuees from annihilation if they can survive the apocalypse first. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with sci-fi. I wrote the series for adults, but it's completely age-appropriate for those 11 and older. Pick up Embark Book 1 today in your preferred format. Available in hardcover, paperback, audiobook, free on Kindle Unlimited, and ebook. If you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with really cool technology, romance, and a lot of unique action, and a lot of it, Embark is perfect for you. Go to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK, Embark, and John, Jon Justice to check out the series today. All right, I look forward to hearing from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Leave a comment up on YouTube. Until next week, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.